It has been 10 days since we went and taken a look at the results of the raid. It's a pretty fitting time at the beginning of this new week since we are now through the reset, which has nerfed quite a bit Nexus King, Saladar and Dimensius, which we had a video on the current level of difficulty of the bosses, the current level of boss progression of the guilds in this expansion and in this tier. And now we are taking a look at the current performance of the specs in the raid. It might also be interesting for players not really into raiding that much yet, or into mythic raiding that much yet, since presumably we are 3.5 or so weeks away from the release of 11.2.5, which includes the Turbo Boost event, which includes the Dinar Vendor, which means if you want to get one of your, for example, best in slot trinkets or one of the cantrip weapons, you have to go and kill those bosses in Mythic on some of your characters. Now, it has been long enough in the tier that we can now see the slightly larger picture other than looking at the usual weekly performance, which would be this one. Right, the classic performance, and looking at where specs are right now, which is quite reminiscent of what we have seen in the past couple of weeks. We have identified our top 5, what was our top 5 for quite a while, which was Destro, Frost Decay, Arcane Mage, Marksmanship Hunter and Elemental Shaman. Those were the 5 specs we have seen at the top the most in these few weeks essentially of the raid. It has been joined nowadays also by Fury Warrior. It has been acknowledged even by other aggregators of data. You can see on Archon in the S tier, those top 5 specs were joined also by Fury Warrior and by Windwalker. Meanwhile, on WoW Meta, you had again the top 5 specs with Fury Warrior just behind them. Now, this is the full picture when it comes to the ranged DPS. It is rather constant, it is rather a nice spread when you look at the end result. You do see them reasonably spread apart from each other. Yes, we do have the outlier at the bottom, which is Balanced Druid. Now, to no surprise, the 3 biggest jumps since the beginning of this reset, obviously, you have Balanced Druid, which went up by a bit. You also had Augmentation Evoker, which went up by a bit, and then the biggest jump was BM Hunter, right? Starting straight on Tuesday, September the 9th. I wonder what happened that Tuesday. That Tuesday was the balance tuning, which buffed BM, and then buffed Augmentation, and then buffed Balance Druid. So those were the increases recently in performance of these 3 specs. Now, as for the squiggly lines, you are wondering, okay, what is all of this? What is this randomness? And the randomness is in the first couple of weeks of the season, excluding the first week, which, you know, was normal raid plus heroic raid, very few mythic logs, and also not even the 4-piece set bonus acquired by all specs. After that, you still had a lot of variance, because, as we say every time, this changes depending on how many bosses are being logged, how many bosses are being progressed by guilds. So obviously, if you start the first couple of weeks where the majority of the logs are on Plexus Sentinel, Plexus Sentinel is a almost pure single target fight. So obviously, all of the specs being logged on Plexus Sentinel will result doing quite well on single target. So Elemental Shaman is first early on, as they were one, or they still are actually one of the best single target specs. You even had back then Demo doing pretty okay in single target, which showed them as doing quite well in results as well. And then early on in the results, you had Soulbinder, which had room for some add damage specs, as well as Araz also had that value with split, cleave, dotting, with specs like Shadow Priest and specs like Affliction Warlock. And then you keep adding more and more bosses, the damage profile changes more and more, so these squiggly lines become more consistent week by week. So in terms of the biggest drops for the range DPS since the beginning of the tier, one goes to Elemental Shaman, because they held their top performance for the first couple of resets of the raid, and then they lost out to at least 3 specs right now for the ranged: Destro, Arcane, and Marksmanship, which have since passed them. Elemental is still the premier single target pick amongst these specs, even in you know, if you look at Dimensius, Elementals seems like a middle of the pack spec. Actually no, they are practically your strongest spec for smooth progress. It's one of the things that will give you the smoothest progress in P1 thanks to the amount of damage they can do to the adds, the living masses. The P2 damage on the main adds, single target damage, is still very good, and then the burn window in P3 is also very relevant for Elemental, and their ability to cast while moving as a ranged in P3 of Dimensions is also very good. So even as they have lost a few positions compared to what was expected in the, or what was seen in the first few weeks, it's still extremely good. What has lost more and is not nearly as good as it seems is Demo, which over time has just went much lower down to being somewhat middle of the pack. Obviously being very much overshadowed by Destruction, which has continued their very high performance throughout the entire tier. The squiggly lines are still there even if we move to melee. In fact, this now looks like even more of a cluster. Fuck. Melees were, I guess, padding a little bit more when it came to add damage. So when it came to looking at the first logs of fights like Soulbinder, bunch of melees for add damage, even Araz. Very shortly after, also a fight like Fractillus was much more friendly towards some of the melee specs due to the less movement in general and less uptime of the range DPS on the boss. So certain melee DPS did, you know, squiggle up and down a bit more early on in the tier. But what is immediately visible compared to the casters is that there isn't nearly as much of an even spread nowadays after, you know, a full month basically of the tier. You can see here we have the gap. We have the gap of Fury and Frost DK compared to the rest. These have now been arisen, both of them, as the best performance. That is why when you look at results like Windwalker, for example, being added in the top results of DPS, or even specs like Havoc or Ret being shown as doing quite well. In context, they kind of are towards the top half of the results, but still quite a ways away from the overall performance of both Fury and Frost DK. This squiggliness early on is for the same reasons, like, you know, random Arms Warrior top DPS for a few days, as well as specs like Survival, specs like Ret early on. All three of the rogues were in the top 5 of results. Similar to what we have said, when you start early on in fights with a lot of add damage, for example, some of the specs were getting much more value. Araz also add damage for these, for example, the rogue specs and Windwalker Monk to do well into. You have other clear signs of this when you see that early on in the tier, this was Unholy, even though Frost is here. For the first 10 days, Unholy was ahead of Frost DK. The raid comes out, the first boss starts being logged, and Unholy was ahead of Frost. And then you had another very quickly after, almost single target boss, Lumitar, and Unholy was still ahead of Frost. So it made sense early on in the tier, with very few logs available in terms of bosses, that Unholy was showing up as ahead of Frost. And then more and more bosses started coming out, and the Frost DK advantage over Unholy was much more clear. Now, the biggest loser overall, if we had to pick one out, is Enhancement. You can see early on Enhancement was LARPing as one of the guys, one of the boys, part of the gang in the middle, you know, just a respectable average DPS. However, this lasted for only a few days before they were found out, and they went all the way to the bottom, joining Pharaoh in terms of results. The other ones in terms of losers are rogues, but at least rogues had some windows of time to be decent early on, and even now they are still played. So early on you had all three of the rogue specs being quite high in the results, and then over time all of them just kept losing more and more. This is something we expected and predicted in terms of rogue performance. These were three specs that could all benefit quite a lot from add damage, either because they were actually padding the add damage like Outlaw or like Assassination, or because they were benefiting from the funnel, from using the extra adds to do more single target damage like Assassination and especially like Subtlety. So obviously what happens the deeper you go into a season, you get buffed, you get more item level, you do more damage, and the bosses get nerfed, which means adds last less and less. So what was previously a 25 seconds add window on Soulbinder becomes a 10-second window on Soulbinder. So all of your specs with great AoE value have much less time to get that benefit. So they are bound to gain less and less value. The only one that is still doing quite well and is still quite valuable is Sub. You know, Dimensius, sure, this is like 3 public logs on Dimensius, so Subtlety is at the moment first. Even if they should not be, they will not be technically first overall on Dimensius, they are still very good. They have okay P1 damage thanks to the adds spawning, but even more so, P2 is where they shine. The amount of adds spawning there, even if they are useless for damage, they can funnel off of them very well in those intermissions, so very good value, even if their overall damage has, you know, plummeted all the way to the bottom. So I feel like this paints a better picture other than looking at your usual weekly results in terms of performance to show which have been the better results in terms of DPS for the past few weeks. For the casters, you had Marksmanship, Arcane, Destro, and Elemental, and for the melees, you had Frost Decay and Fury Warrior, with a distant third being Windwalker Monk. In terms of prizes, the prize for the most improved ranged DPS goes to BM. It's a fake prize, of course, they are only improving because they have been buffed, not really because of any other reason. And the prize for the most depreciated in value, the most fallen off since the beginning of the season, goes to Demo. Although that was more expected, even though they have fallen off, Destro was already expected to be doing very well, and then when you looked at the damage profiles of the bosses, Destro was going to be stronger, so it was normal that more and more players would have abandoned Demo over time, so their performance would also have dropped, because fewer and fewer top players were gonna be staying as Demo. For the melees, the number one prize for the biggest fall off goes to Enhancement, with the honorable mention also of Outlaw Rogue, which started the first few days of the season pretending like they were the top DPS, and they have fallen off like 10 different spots in the rankings of melees, while the prize for the most improved over time goes to Fury Warrior, which perhaps isn't really because they haven't improved a lot. Not many of the melee specs have gotten a massive improvement over the tier. It's just interesting to see them being able to keep up and raise their performance up at the same time as Frost Death Knight, which was more expected. Right out of the specs, we were expecting to be doing very well, even just by looking at the sims before the season. Frost Decay was the expected top performer, Fury Warrior less so. Now, the other one we have to look at is the healers. Now, you have seen the squiggliness of the range, you have seen the even bigger squiggliness of lines of the melee DPS, so this will look much weirder, because there is essentially no squiggliness when we are talking about the healers. The rankings were practically decided the first week of the season. The only change here is dating back almost a month, which is Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin started the first week as the third best healer, and then they went as the sixth best. Meanwhile, all of the other healers pretty much kept their performance value. Now, if you're not a healer yourself, the answer is obvious. It is reasonable for the DPS to have such unstable, squiggly lines early on, because their performance depends on the damage profile of the types of bosses that are being logged. So, You start with Plexus Sentinel, which is pure single target, so the good single target specs will show up as doing well. Then you move over to Soulbinder, it's a bunch of AoE, so of course the specs doing well in AoE will show up as doing well. And this will continue as you log more and more bosses, which is why it's a bit more unstable early on for the DPS when talking about performance. But for healers, the healing profile of the bosses is pretty much always the same. You have rot damage ticking on the entire raid, you have certain mechanics hitting a few players by a bit more. It could be the lines or the orbs on Soulbinder, it could be the ads or the pools on the ground on Araz, it could be the dots, the debuffs on Soul Hunters, and then you have big cooldown raid AoE healing mechanics. Of course, they come in different shapes and different sizes. Some of the raid damage windows happen every 20 seconds or every 30 or every minute, but overall the healing patterns stay the same. So once you have clocked the type of healers doing well early on, it's very likely that they will remain the ones doing well for the remainder of the tier. So there is much less window for surprises as you keep going deeper in the raid for healers than there is for DPS. It's not that there is like, oh, we now reached Fractillus and Fractillus does only AoE. No single target, no spot healing, it just ticks everyone's HP for like 30% of their HP every second, and you just have to raid heal and nothing else. And then Nexus King does 0 AoE. There is like no burst AoE damage, no rot damage. It's just a bunch of single target chunks to like 7 random players at a time. They drop to like dead in 2 seconds and you need to spot heal them. So you go from one boss fight where only the top spread raid-wide healers are doing well, like Preservation or Mistweaver or Resto Druid, and then the fight after you have Holy Priest, Holy Paladin, Resto Shaman and spot healing specs doing better. That doesn't really happen when it comes to healers. So it's more natural to see these healer specs not really change much in their performance even after more than a month of the raid tier. So we can't really give out any prizes of the more improved one and the one who has fallen off the most in the healer category, because they have been pretty much the same since the beginning of the tier. And I will take the prize. This is what we expected. Sometimes people say, well, this doesn't matter, it's still PTR, it will change when it goes live. Actually, no. When we looked at the results in the PTR testing, the 3 best performers were Preservation, Mistweaver and Holy Priest. The 3 in the middle were Resto Druid, Resto Shaman and Holy Paladin, and the one at the deep bottom was Disc Priest. This was from the PTR. So we went into the actual raid and absolutely nothing changed. This is what we have had in terms of the performance for the healers as well. Definitely more room for changes and surprises, as we have seen when it came to ranged and melee DPS than when it came to healers. So we have missed the last 10 days of our recap when it came to the raid performance, so we had to catch up on the beginning of this week by trying to look not just at the very latest results in the raid, but also looking at how things have gone since the beginning of the raid tier all the way up to now. So with this now getting us closer to yet another weekly reset, quite a relevant one, because in a couple of days you will be getting another 3% healing and damage buff from the raid Renown on top of your fourth available crafted item that you will get on this weekly reset. So we will see as things will keep progressing in the raid, but for today on this Monday, this is what we have when it came to covering the specs performances in this weekly reset. For today, on this Monday, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, it wasn't really planned, but we went for a stop-and-go fragmented sleep schedule. We sleep for 3 hours, wake up 2 hours, sleep for 2, wake up again, and 3 hours later sleep for 3 hours more. I guess it worked out.